On this week's Political Figure episode, we've got Chips Ahoy. Sorry, Chip Roy, who is far worse in every single way than a chocolate chip cookie. But nonetheless, he is a character I find incredibly interesting. Charles Eugene Chip Roy was born August 7th, 1972 in the town that makes some of the best video games known to man. Actually, technically, Bethesda Games is in Rockville, Maryland, but that's not important. He was raised in Lovitz, Virginia, graduated from Loudoun Valley High School, and got a bachelor's in commerce and a master's in information systems from the University of Virginia. He was an investment banker analyst for a little while, but like most conservatives, he was terrified of New York, and fearing that his career would make him relocate there, he decided to go to Texas and become a lawyer. While still in law school, he began working for then Texas Attorney General John Cornyn. Cornyn ended up working for the Baby Bush administration, and he took old Chip with him. And then in 2009, he resigned from working for Cornyn to go ghostwrite full-time for Rick Perry and work on Rick Perry's presidential campaign. It was in this book that we got to first really start publicly seeing some of Dip Chip's political beliefs, like how he thinks Social Security is an unconstitutional Ponzi scheme, or how he thinks we should go back to electing U.S. senators by state legislature vote rather than popular vote from, us. Because, the system isn't rigged enough already against voters with, gerrymandering and the Electoral College and the two-party system and the outweighted vote of senators from low-population states. He also wants to repeal the 16th Amendment so he could get rid of federal income tax because, fuck poor people. Fish and Chip here also believes that the federal government spending basically any money on states is like communism. So naturally, Governor Perry appointed him to the State Federal Relations Office of Texas, which is responsible for, getting money in the form of grants and subsidies from the federal government for the state of Texas. Which honestly makes total and complete sense when you consider the fact that Texans are stupid. In 2011, he was diagnosed with stage 3 Hodgkin's lymphoma, a diagnosis he would go on to beat thanks to the socialist healthcare he hates so much. Because he's a government employee, so he got his healthcare for free, paid for by us. And he actually kind of illegally started working for Ted Cruz's PAC while still being employed by the state of Texas, and he didn't resign from the state of Texas because he still wanted that sweet, sweet socialist healthcare he hates so much. And despite going way out of his way to make sure that he could hang on to his socialist tax-funded healthcare so he didn't die of cancer, he spent the majority of his career trying to gut Medicare and overturn Obamacare. Because again, fuck those poor people. Sorry, to beat this dead horse a little bit further before we move on, after going through cancer, he said he became really aware of how convoluted the healthcare system is. And that made him an even more firm believer in healthcare freedom, which is really just a libertarian way of saying that a privatized healthcare system should be free to decide whether you can afford to live or die. But in his case, it meant that he believed in his freedom to have government healthcare that you shouldn't be allowed to have. During this time in Texas, Chip met Ted Cruz, and he said he became really close friends with Ted Cruz, which is clearly a lie because nobody is friends with Ted Cruz. Quite literally, everybody in the universe hates Ted Cruz. We're pretty sure that's why the aliens banished him here. Ted Cruz doesn't even like Ted Cruz. So if you're willing to lie about liking Ted Cruz, what else are you willing to lie about? Anyway, Lead Paint Chip Roy pretended to like Ted Cruz so he could further his career by working as Ted Cruz's chief of staff when he was elected to the Senate in 2012. Also, Texas, remember how earlier in the video I said you were stupid? Yeah, Ted Cruz has been your senator since 2012. And you just re-elected him, so he will likely be there for at least another 6 more years. Fucking stupid. However, it was at this point, as Rafael Cruz's chief of staff, that Chip Roy started coming out as an interesting character. He started shit-talking Republicans as much, if not more, than Democrats. He said Tom Coburn was serving on a surrender caucus. He said Mitch McConnell was basically the same as Barack Obama, which is a wild fucking statement. He was critical of John McCain for talking to Chuck Schumer, I guess. Which, to be fair, Chuck Schumer does suck. During this time, he really started bitching about the debt a lot, and the debt has been his thing. Like, he is obsessed with the debt. He came out as a very hardline conservative, to the point where he was willing to talk badly about any member of his own party who didn't agree with his conservative positions. He was basically arguing that Mitch McConnell, the geriatric mutant obstruction turtle's obstruction, wasn't enough obstruction, which is, again, fucking wild. And I want to be critical of this mindset and these stances, and believe me, there's plenty to be critical about on that. But this happens to be one of the things, maybe the only thing, yeah, probably the only thing, that makes me respect Chip Roy more than the majority of his Republican colleagues and even a few Democrats. But we'll get into that in a little bit. Anyway, Chip Roy returned to Texas and became Texas's assistant attorney general under Ken Paxton, who was just a total piece of shit who was investigated for fraud, bribery, crime, corruption, pretty much everything you expect from, Republicans. But he kept very busy as assistant attorney general trying to get rid of health care, stop brown people from coming to the country, and stop women from having bodily autonomy and access to health care, all the greatest hits. He sued the Obama administration a lot. Then in 2016, he went and worked for the Cruz PAC. This is where I said the controversy came from, where, you know, he was still technically a state employee, so he could keep his health care to treat his cancer, the same health care that he doesn't want any of us to have. But that was illegal for him to do because, you know, he was also working for a PAC, and you can't work for a PAC and be a state employee. Anyway, he did that for a little while until Ted Cruz didn't become president because everybody hates Ted Cruz. And then he worked for a couple conservative think tanks until he decided to run for Congress in 2018. He won and has since been a U.S. representative for the state of Texas. After winning, he called himself a conservative AOC, which I believe she found very offensive. I know I would have. But he clarified by saying, well, they would probably disagree ideologically and politically on basically everything. They both agree that functionally the system is broken. You see, he thinks it's broken because it allows poor people to exist, but she thinks it's broken because it allows poor people to exist. He's a member of the Freedom Caucus, which is, you know, where all of the worst of the terrible people in Washington hang out. He did a 21-hour Cory Booker-style filibuster bitching about Obamacare at one point for no apparent reason. And I could spend this time going through all of his policy positions, but I can save us a lot of time. Just think of a shitty Republican policy. Yeah, he supports that. But here's where he gets interesting and where that teeny tiny microscopic speck of respect I have for him comes from. He will stand very strongly for his values and ideologies regardless of what his party tells him to do. Now, those values and ideologies are usually fucking horrible, but at least they're not hypocritical, and that is sadly a breath of fresh air in 2025. He's been vocally critical of Trump since the beginning. One of his biggest criticisms of Trump was his conservative credentials, saying that he had donated to both Democrats and Planned Parenthood in the past. Also, at the time, when Trump was running for the nomination, he claimed that Trump supported public funding of healthcare, which is, you know, horrible, unless, of course, again, it's his healthcare, and public funding of Palestine, because Chip Roy is a raging Zionist who loves genocide, but clearly they've come together on that particular issue now. In addition to that, he's been one of the few Republicans, and maybe the only Republican, to call out MAGA on some of their hypocritical bullshit and not have it tank his career. Most specifically on their hypocritical inability to do basic math. He really hates the debt. Like, he loves hating the debt. It is his favorite thing to hate. It's what he spends like 90% of his time talking about. And like all the other Republicans, he too wants to stop spending taxpayer money on us, the taxpayers. But unlike other Republicans who spend all of their time pretending to care about the debt and then get into office and pass spending bills that add astronomical amounts to the debt Democrats could only fucking dream of, he does not. And he calls out that Republican spending bills all increase debt. He does his best to obstruct them and calls them out very vocally for being fucking hypocrites on the debt every time they try to pass one. So bravo. He also spent a lot of time trying to overturn the 2020 election until he realized the fraud that the Trump administration and these states claimed that they had didn't actually exist, and then he reversed course. He started criticizing Republicans for pushing conspiracy theories, and once again stood by his principles about certifying the election and called them out on their hypocrisy, saying that it was states' rights to delegate their electors and it was simply Congress's job to count them, and any attempts to interfere with that was an interference in states' rights and unconstitutional, and stood on business saying that if Republicans continued to say that the presidential election was fraudulent and Joe Biden was fraudulently elected, that they also could not be sworn into office because they were on the same fucking ballot. If they were on the same ballots that they claim were fraudulent, their elections weren't certifiable either, and they're fucking hypocrites for expecting to be sworn in if they weren't willing to do their job and certify the election. He called for Donald Trump to rein in his treason tribe on January 6th, and well, he didn't vote to impeach Trump the second time around. He did say Trump's actions were impeachable, so I don't know, some credit, I guess. But he's still, for some reason, trying to pretend that he's actually friends with Ted Cruz, and so he still defended him despite him being an election denier and despite him fueling the January 6th insurrection, saying that it was topics he didn't agree with him on, but they could just agree to disagree, because it really wasn't that big of a deal. So old Chippendale here is still a unimaginably giant piece of shit, and still a hypocrite about quite a few things, mostly healthcare and Ted Cruz. But he's a lot less of a hypocrite than the other gigantic pieces of shit he calls his colleagues. And you know what? Any Republican who is willing to call out Republicans in MAGA's America deserves at least a modicum of respect for that. Because this insanely cultish tribal party politics bullshit is killing our country. And I'd much rather have a couple hundred more Chip Roys in the ranks of Republicans who are at least willing to vote for the things that they pretend that they care about, even if I disagree with those things, rather than these legions of mindless, treasonous Trumpers who will lie and grift and fuck us into fascism for nothing more than a pat on the head from Daddy Donnie. God, it's fucking depressing that our country is in such a state of fuckery that I would be happy to have more Chip Roys. I need a drink.